explore how studying makes you feel more specifically, and then try to address those feelings. What is the fear or a concern that you have beneath, underneath the urge to pull? Because the same way you approach the emotions, you can also approach the urge and explore it as a kind of information. Can this be simplified for a child? Yes. So there are some books on mindfulness for children as well. One of the most famous authors in mindfulness is called Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's actually the guy who introduced mindfulness, I think, in Western psychology. His wife, I believe her name is Mila Kabat-Zinn. She wrote 1 or 2 books about how to teach mindfulness to children. So many of these techniques you can find there, and you can find them specifically simplified for children. But yes, I guess that would depend on how old your child is as well. But yes, you can. I have been battling trich for 5 years now and decided to shave my head 3 weeks ago. I have not had urges to pull since then, but how can I help myself to not relapse back into trich once my hair grows? I have a keen habit-aware bracelet. Should I still use this when I don't have the urge with my short hair to pull? So let me first address the second part, and then I will address the first part. So the second part about the habit-aware bracelets. I find them to be very useful when you want to practice habit reversal. The first part of habit reversal training is usually to become more aware of pulling, because the mindless pulling is you can't apply a technique unless you know what you're doing. So this is where habit aware is very useful. It's like an amplifier for your habit reversal training. But in itself, the bracelet is not going to resolve entirely the problem that you have, but it will be a very useful tool. So if you technically don't experience any urges, and if most of your urges are focused, for example, you don't have to use the bracelet now. What I would do if I were you is I would try for this period before your hair starts to grow back, I would start practicing some of the techniques that will help you be more proactive, like mindfulness techniques or equanimity. I would try to alter my work-life balance. So I would try to introduce some lifestyle changes so that I minimize the urges to begin with. Because urges usually arise more in specific circumstances. So the previous question or one before that was about feeling urges to pull while you study. So now you have some time to reorganize whatever context in your life is producing the urges, or at least helping you produce urges. So I would be proactive in that sense. Also, if you're considering starting a program, you can work on identifying triggers from the past. And then as your hair starts to grow back, you can already have a set of tools that you can apply to take control of the urges. So for now, I don't think there's any reason to respond very briefly. No reason to use habit aware if you're not experiencing any urges. What to do when feeling so stressed out and overthinking everything to the point that it's making me anxious? If overthinking is what you primarily think is causing you to feel anxious, then I would suggest that you use, I'm trying to list some techniques because these are more for the anxiety part, and you can apply any of them to anxiety as well. But if it's overthinking, what I would use is perhaps some of the mindfulness techniques, specifically self-compassion techniques. And also another thing that might be useful when you're overthinking, and this is not a mindfulness technique, is just take a piece of paper and just write down all the thoughts that you can. This is one way that you can distance yourself from your thoughts. Another thing that you can do, which sounds silly but works very well, is to try to notice what's the common theme of the thoughts that you're having, and then just thank your mind for having this thought. This is a technique that's included in the TrichStop program, and it often confuses people, but once they try it, it works very well. The way I think this technique can be sort of thought of effectively is like, you know, that annoying cousin that we all have when you go to family reunions and then they have so much advice to offer, and none of that is needed or asked for. And then you will say yes, 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 even though you really have no intention of doing what they say, and you don't really even listen to them. So that's the same way when you say, thank you, mind, for this thought. That's the same attitude of, yes, I hear you, but thank you, but no thank you. So that's the kind of approach you can also adopt. This is in session 6 in TrichStop program. But if you want to deal specifically with anxiety, then equanimity is something that I would recommend. It works very well for anxiety. Is denial common? Well, I would need a little more information because I'm not sure about the context of the question, but denial is something that we do very frequently as human beings, yes. I missed most of the webinar due to the time difference. How can I watch it again? So tomorrow or day after tomorrow, I'm not sure when, you will receive an email, and this will be up on YouTube, so you can watch it there. I pull split ends when I'm bored. I feel like I'm fixing my hair when actually I'm ruining it. Some days are better than others. I notice when I put my hair in a ponytail, I will not pull as much. Now that I'm working from home in my downtime and focus on organizing my house, any suggestions? So putting your hair in a ponytail would be an example of stimulus control. So if you remove what would normally cause the urge to arise, then you're fine. The first thing I would urge you to do is to explore what you mean when you say bored. I have almost an aversion to the word boredom because personally, that's not a state that I experience very frequently. Actually, I'm almost never bored. The reason for that is because when I recognize that I don't want to be doing what I'm doing, I just change what I'm doing to something else. So it's very important that you realize what boredom is to you. If boredom means not having anything to do, then the question is, why is it that you're not taking care of yourself and actually finding something to stimulate yourself? And if boredom is actually associated with thoughts and emotions and sort of ruminating on problems that you have, then it's the thoughts that you should be addressing. Next month, the topic for the webinar will be mindfulness, and I will be giving you the basics of how to establish mindfulness practice, what exactly is mindfulness, and how you can use mindfulness to cope with hair pulling. So this is so if you can come next month or watch that webinar, maybe that will be actually more useful for working with thoughts. And if you want to deal with the urge, then you can use the grounding in the body technique, for example. When you feel the urge to pull, you can exactly find a way to locate the urge in the level of your body, then switch to those parts of your body that are still stable and calm, and then balance that out and take away some of the power of the urge. Thank you. I'm so glad you went over time. Well, I'm glad that you don't mind me going over time, but I tend to digress and give too many examples. So I'm trying to stop doing that. So I'm trying to be on time, but apparently I'm failing in that, which is fine. The example of step 1 was so pertinent because I'm studying for it. Any more tips for med students? Well, God help you. I'm just kidding. So yeah, step 1 is, to me, I think step 1 broke my brain. That's, I think, the only way that I can describe it, because I didn't take it after I actually took those courses. I took it a little later. And then, I had to relearn all of that. And there's just so much information. So in terms of study tips, I can give you so many, but that would, I think, alienate 2/3 of the audience currently. But in terms of how to cope with that, my suggestion would be, if you're going to study for step 1, try to just leave space for that and do nothing else. And then balance out your time between time for self-care and de-stressing and studying, and try to eliminate any other distraction. Because one of the mistakes that I made while trying to study for the step 1 in the beginning was that I was trying to work and study for step 1. That just doesn't work. And then I stopped, and then I tried to study for step 1 and maintain social life, and that also didn't work. So what I really had to do was split my time between meditation and step 1, and that's basically how I passed it. Because I mean, I teach meditation, but only because I practice it. So I've been practicing meditation for I think 11 years at this point. So for me, that's like a refuge from the world. And when I feel very, very stressed, that's automatically where I tend to go for. So self-care and studying. And when you study, don't go for details, just do the basic points. And then, you know, second time around, add more details. Because unless you have the basic structure of the whole thing, it will be very difficult. My work causes a lot of stress sometimes, and that is when I get the urge to pull hair. I cannot avoid working. How can I handle it? And I know we can't avoid working. It's really such a drag. Just kidding. So if your work is causing you stress, the first thing you should be able to do is figure out a way to rearrange your work environment to make it more pleasant for yourself and find a way to incorporate some de-stressing techniques during your work hours. If you can make smaller breaks, or if you can rearrange your schedule so that you don't have these blocks when you do something for 4 hours at a time. So for example, I really like clinical work and I love working with people. But what I don't love is paperwork. So what I will do is I will schedule my sessions or answering messages for TrichStop in between doing paperwork. So I do a little bit of something that I like, then a little bit of something that's stressing me out, and then when it starts to stress me out, I go back to something that I actually enjoy. And also, one thing when it comes to stress, people usually look for these kinds of life hacks to deal with stress. There are no life hacks for stress. If you want to do proper stress management, then you need to incorporate lifestyle changes and stress management techniques. Uh, Techniques that can be mindfulness and can be some other form of relaxation, it can be physical activity, it can be many different things. I mean, if you just Google stress management, you'll get an overwhelming amount of information. But you really do have to change the way you approach work and your life. And I'm afraid there's no way around it if you want effective stress management. Because everything else that you do will be cosmetics and it will work for 2 weeks and then you will fall off the wagon again. So you need to think long term when it comes to stress. And also maybe the way you think about your work as well. How much of an emotional investment your work deserves. Like I'm the last person to say this because you can't really do therapy without being emotionally involved, but you can also be emotionally involved in a healthy way. And then very frequently, because work has such a central part to play in our culture, we invest ourselves emotionally far more than most work deserves. Filling out a form doesn't deserve your emotional investment. It's just a form. And then that's also something that you might want to consider. How do you cope with all of the emotions that are coming with the realization that your eyelashes after 20 plus years of picking are not growing back? And you're consumed with the knowledge that you will have damaged yourself for life with no going back. Consumed by it's too late. Well, this is, if you remember in the beginning when I was talking about guilt, I said something but in passing and I didn't really elaborate, which is that sometimes we tend to cling on to guilt. And in general, when we feel bad emotions, especially people who don't have a lot of confidence and who are very hard on themselves, they will take that emotion, hug it, and not let it go away. And this seems like exactly what you're doing. What you're saying is, I will now forever have to suffer because I've done something bad in the past. Yes, and you may have consequences. I don't know your condition, so I don't know exactly whether or not it's permanent or not. But even if it is permanent, if you hold on to that suffering forever, then suffering will indeed last forever. One of the things about emotions that we really should keep in mind is that they always pass away. That's something that you learn very early on in your mindfulness practice, is that no matter how intense or difficult an emotion is, it will arise, it will stay here for a while, and it will pass away. And when you do this, what you just wrote there, I did this to myself and now I will forever have to suffer, you're actually cultivating the emotion and not the way to accept what's happening. If indeed you will have damaged eyelashes, then the question for you is how to stop doing that damage as soon as you can. So what are practical steps that you can take what are the techniques that will help you deal with hair pulling, so that you can be proactive, and then see if there's anything that you can do to improve your appearance cosmetically so that you're happier with yourself. But saying I will have to suffer because I did this to myself means that you're basically clinging on to guilt instead of using it in a useful way. I don't mean to sound, like I'm accusing you, and I don't mean to sound harsh, but that's just a very good example of what I was talking about. That's when you use guilt to punish yourself instead of to grow. There's a quote by John Dewey somewhere, I believe, where I'm going to paraphrase it grossly because I don't remember exactly where it's from or how it goes. But he says that we all have certain principles that we would rather die than break. And sometimes in life, it just so happens that we do break these principles. And then he says, so what should we do? Should we kill ourselves? Should we continue to live with guilt forever? And Dewey goes on to say that both of these options are really not very useful or very good. If you kill yourself, then you basically have no chance to make up for anything. You have no chance to change. And if you live with guilt forever, then you also cannot change because you're too busy wallowing in guilt. That becomes a kind of self-punishment. And instead, Dewey says we should throw away both of these alternatives. And what we should do is just live in a way to try and not do it again. And I think this is the same thing that applies to you as well. You may have pulled for 20 years, but you don't have to pull for one more. It's just not necessary. But if you cling on to guilt, you will feel bad because guilt equals suffering, right? When you cling to guilt, you increase your own suffering. That will add to your stress levels, therefore make you pull even more. So when you hold on to guilt, you're actually perpetuating pulling. I would like to put my emotions into words, but putting emotions into words is difficult for me. Is there something you recommend to do to start this habit? So I would then maybe recommend that you start with grounding in the body and mapping out where certain emotions are in your body. If you like to journal, for example, that's a very good way to understand your emotions better. You can write down what sensations you feel and where, and then you can also describe what was happening in that moment. And then after a while, you can go through your journal and try to find themes that repeat themselves. And that way you will discover what sensation is connected to sort of what aspect of your life, or, so that is how you will learn to connect your emotions to feelings. And also keep in mind that when we talk about labels for emotions, really like sadness, joy, happiness, whatever, those are just labels that we as society use. When you talk about your emotional life, even if you work with a therapist, you can use whatever words you like. You can make up your own words for your emotions. It doesn't matter. It's just a label. Labels are important so that you know what to do with them. And your therapist. Your therapist needs to learn your labels, and you know your labels. So your labels at the end of the day are the only things that count. So you don't have to use any official name for emotions. You can just, I don't know, call them any way you like that sadness that you feel when you hear Leonard Cohen. It's also fine. So it's try to develop your own language for that by following sensations and seeing how they repeat themselves. My daughter is 11 and pulls eyebrows. She now just rubs and appears frustrated by the hair that still grows. She says area feels tingly, but when we notice she has pulled, she denies it. So I'm not sure what kind of advice you're looking for because there's no question that I can see. So what I can say from this is that your daughter is too young for TrichStop, for example. Our program, I think, is for people 16 and above. Sometimes we accept clients that are 15 or 14, but mainly it's for adolescents and grown-ups. But you may want to consult a child psychologist specifically. Because of your daughter's age, you really need someone who is trained to offer techniques on the level that she can grasp. Because to talk about grounding in the body with her might be difficult. So you may need to find someone who knows how to speak her language. Otherwise, there are some of these things, like a habit-aware bracelet is something that she can also use. I'm trying to think which of the techniques. So any competing response, but if she feels frustrated or if she denies that she's pulling, it may mean that she's actually not even aware that she's pulling. So you may want to gently explain to her what is it that you see, and try to work with her to make her more aware. That's very important. I frequently see parents of adolescents, at least, who have a kind of aggressive approach, and they say, oh, you need to stop doing this and stop doing this. And that just adds to the stress and pressure that the child feels. And when they're more stressed or more anxious, they're of course more likely to do it even more. So it's very important that you're gentle and kind in your approach to her. My struggles with pulling make me feel tremendous shame and self-loathing. Could you say a little more about how I can apply some of these techniques to these feelings? So when it comes to shame and self-loathing, their direct antidotes would be compassion and loving kindness. You can try those guided meditations and then cultivate them as an approach to yourself, but I would be very cautious so that it doesn't backfire, because sometimes when you try to go from self-loathing to self-love, it can feel quite artificial, so you may have to take smaller steps. In constructivism, there is actually a definition of shame, and it's very similar to guilt. If guilt is when you step outside of how you see yourself, shame is when you're stepping outside of how you think other people perceive you. So constructivism can offer you a way to work with shame. So whenever you feel shame, it means this is not something other people expect me to be doing. And maybe you can try to locate where this shame comes from and who are the people you're actually ashamed of. Because it's never that generic. Like it had to have originated from a specific person in your past or in your present, of course. And then when it comes to self-loathing, I think this is a matter of acceptance, perhaps. I would really need to have more information to be able to give you a more specific way of working with it. But self-loathing basically means I cannot stand looking at this part of myself. And self-loathing is not just a terribly unpleasant experience, it's also what prevents us from changing very frequently. If you cannot stand to look at a part of yourself, then how on earth can you devise a useful technique to change that? So before you can stop pulling, you actually have to work with self-loathing. You have to learn how to accept pulling as a part of yourself. By accepting, I don't mean liking. We can accept many things that we don't like. So accepting pulling as a part of yourself that you don't like is the first step. And also self-indifference just comes to my mind as something that you might want to consider. What are the most common sources of the urges to pull in terms of emotions and circumstances and experiences? So very frequently, pulling will be a form of experiential avoidance, at least from the perspective of acceptance and commitment therapy, meaning that if you don't know how to cope with a certain emotion or a set of emotions, then you will pull, because pulling puts you in a kind of trance-like state where you don't really actually feel much as you pull, or you feel some sort of relief. So pulling can be a way not to deal with certain emotions. In some instances, pulling can also be a reflection of how you relate to yourself, or lack of self-compassion, or maybe perfectionism. It can be a form of self-punishment. It can be like there are many. That's a very general question that you're asking, because in my experience, when I work with people, nearly anything can trigger people to pull. And it's not also just the act of pulling. Sometimes it's about the sensory pleasure from touching a hair. Sometimes it's about breaking split ends. Sometimes it's about twisting the hair. Sometimes it's about observing the hair. And all these things can have different meanings and then obviously different causes and different consequences. But I would say when it comes to emotions, I would say anxiety, general stress, and guilt. Those would be the three main ones I associate with. I'm fully aware of when I pull, bored, hungry, stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed. The more I try to keep busy, the more the urge to pull is great. How do I stop? Um, this is actually an example of what I was just talking about when I was talking about experiential avoidance. Keeping yourself busy can sometimes mean not dealing with stress, hunger, anger, or boredom. So your task would perhaps be to also learn how to address these emotions. If you're feeling stressed, then what you need is a stress management tool. If you're feeling anxious, then you may need to do something to relax. So, like for example, progressive muscle relaxation or body scanning or just running, physical activity, walking, taking a break. So many things can be relaxing for one person. But when you try to keep yourself busy, that usually means that you're avoiding facing the emotion or the thought. Acceptance and commitment therapy that TrichStop is based on actually teaches you to stay with experiences rather than to try to run through them or go around them. It's something that I was talking about when I was talking about equanimity as well. How can I use rain if I'm aware about what I'm doing, but I cannot stop my hand? Well, in that case, I suppose you would have a hard time using rain, but rain would be maybe rain technique is best used for intense emotions. Uh, when it comes to the urge, what maybe you could do is focus on how your hand feels as it moves. Just try to really pinpoint how the urge looks like in your hand specifically. That would maybe be a better approach. Another thing in these situations that you can do until you find a way to gain a little more control is prevent your hand from pulling in a way that's satisfactory. So you can wear gloves, for example. If sensory aspect of pulling or twirling or feeling a specific type of hair is important to you, if you wear gloves, you won't be able to do that, so the urge will lessen. Or if you don't like to wear gloves, you can use latex finger covers as well. For example, that's quite useful. That's something that you can do. So even if you can't stop your hand, in that instance, you stop it from pulling. Some other things that people often recommend in habit reversal training would be to hold an object in your hand uh, and just squeeze it very tightly. So even if your hand will move, it'll still have something in it. So you won't be able to pull. Do you know of any correlation between pulling and diet? I believe someone asked me this in the webinar where I talked about research. Um, the only, I haven't read any research that relates to this, but I have seen people tell me that it's sometimes related to certain types of food and also to caffeine because it makes you more anxious and restless. And then unless you have healthier ways to be with your anxiety, you're more likely to interpret anxiety as the urge to pull and then pull to calm yourself down. So yes, but it's not a direct causal connection. It's more that certain types of food are contributing factors. Is not is not feeling enough a common feeling with TrichStop? Yes. The, people not feeling like they're good enough, and then that causing pulling, and then using pulling as further proof that you're not good enough is quite common. Yes. So that's the answer to your question. But if you have any more detailed questions about this, please feel free to ask. But yes, it is quite common. I have been able to recognize my impulsiveness, and the first I do is think I don't have to. The next day, my thoughts are the same of pull my hair. Oh, so your thoughts of pulling your hair are the same. And I feel that I can no longer control them. I feel more impulsive and I can no longer control myself and I relapse. One thing that I don't recommend when you're trying to stop is to try to physically overpower the urge, because willpower will work for 24 hours or 1 week, but it will not work forever. If you want to reduce impulsivity, then maybe mindfulness would be good for you, because there's so much evidence from scientific studies that show that mindfulness actually strengthens our executive functioning, meaning that you get more power over what you do. So you gain more control of your behavior. But this is not a short-term thing. All these studies that show that mindfulness can help you with this refer to long-standing practice. So usually it's 8, 12 weeks or even more. So maybe try introducing mindfulness as a daily practice, and also make sure to introduce a competing response that you can use when you feel the urge to pull. Some of the competing responses can be fidget toys or bouncing balls or infinity cubes or squeeze toys, like whatever works for you. You just have to try out some and then figure out what works best. Thank you. You're welcome. During my exams, I find myself getting stressed out, but when I try to calm myself down, I only get more stressed out and waste time, which continues the cycle. And then I have the urge to pull. Any suggestions on how to combat this? I'm not exactly sure how you calm yourself down if you become more stressed out. So maybe whatever it is that you're doing, you should maybe stop doing. When you have to study for a long time for exams, it really helps to structure your studying and to create realistic goals. And this actually also works for people who want to join TrichStop. When you start the program or therapy of any sorts, thinking in 8 or 10 or whatever number of weeks, I have to stop pulling entirely. Or when you say to yourself, I will learn 65 pages in the next 2 hours, you basically tell yourself, I will fail. So when you set goals, you have to make sure that they're doable and realistic. And the same goes for studying. So you need to assess how quickly your stress levels rise, and then try to intervene by creating small pauses when your stress levels are manageable. Because when stress sort of escalates into the urge to pull, that's already too late to stop it. You need to stop it much, much sooner. So change the way you study, change the duration of your study sessions, and make sure to pay attention to your stress levels. One way that you can do that is find where stress is accumulating in your body, and then just check in with that part of your body from time to time and see, where is it on the scale from 1 to I will have the urge to pull, and try to interrupt it halfway through. Thank you so much. You're welcome. How do you stop intrusive, disturbing thoughts? So this is the approach to this is quite different than what I was describing here. You can perhaps modify RAIN to work for this, but what I would use is maybe labeling or certain types of cognitive diffusion techniques. So that's not something that I talked about today because they're more applicable for thoughts, and this is working with emotions. But that would be to learn how to actively rephrase your thoughts as they're occurring so that you know that they're just thoughts. Another way would be perhaps to challenge those thoughts. Another way still would be to see what's the evidence for these thoughts. Then another way would be to develop a kind of mindful awareness where you can let those thoughts come and go without being attached to them. But this really depends on the level of intrusiveness of thoughts, because intrusive thoughts can be, colloquially, when people talk about these thoughts, they can refer to something like compulsive thoughts or just ruminations. And then they can also refer to something more serious in a psychiatric sense, which then requires more serious treatment as well. So I'm not sure what level of intensity we're talking about. Will you be sharing the YouTube link? Yes, you will receive it in your mailbox. I've had this for 11 years. I managed to stop, but I always come back, and it is stressing me out knowing that I ruined my hair and it will take long to grow back. I'm so tired and I don't know what to do. It is affecting everything in my life. So if you've managed to stop in the past, I don't know exactly how long these periods were when you managed to stop, But if I were to start sort of now talking to you about this, I would ask you to see what triggered you to start again. Not so much how you stopped, but what triggered you to start again. Because this is, so pooling is a resource for something. One of the previous webinars, when I was giving you a case study of pooling, I was talking and endlessly emphasizing how pooling always has meaning and how every symptom performs a function. When you can replace pooling 9 out of 10 situations, it's the 10th situation that you should be analyzing, the one where you have to pull, because this is where the function of pooling is revealed. So those moments when you started pulling again will tell you exactly what's the function of pulling in your life. And then that's what you should be working on. I used to pull my lashes and I still tend to touch them. How can I stop? Well, if you're not pulling them, just touching them, I'm not sure why you would. I mean, I can understand that it may be an annoying habit, but if it doesn't damage your eyelashes, perhaps it's okay if you touch them. But if you really want to stop, then maybe habit-aware bracelet would be a good way to go, because it has a very simple way of functioning, which is that it will make a sound every time you reach for your eyelashes. So that way you will be aware and you can lower your hand down. That's one way to go. Let me just briefly see what time it is. Okay, so we've had about an hour almost of Q&As. So let's sort of bring it slowly to an end. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Let me see if there are some questions here that we can briefly address. So where can I find the webinar? You really like Kelly? Yes. Yes, indeed. I really do like George Kelly. And the reason why I will become a laughing stock because I promote Kelly so much. The reason why I like Kelly is because I think he's an incredibly was an incredibly original thinker. I think he anticipated and predicted some trends in neuroscience, like over half a century ago. And because his theory is so dense and difficult, he's neglected and not read enough. So anytime that I can digest a part of it and show people how useful it is, I will take that chance. Although next time, since the topic is mindfulness, I'm not sure if I will be able to incorporate Kelly there, but I will try to find a way. The reason I started was stress from studying an emotional breakup, broke up with my fiance, how to deal with that. So stress from studying, I have addressed several times here, and I don't know what else to add unless you have a specific question. In terms of an emotional breakup, I think the part about equanimity that allows you to open up towards suffering is something that might be important. Because when we break up with someone, in a strange way, that's actually not that different from when someone dies, because we're losing a person that was and still is quite important to us. When we lose someone, like when we lose an object, when someone goes away forever, what we need to do is mourn. The same way you would mourn a loss of an actual person that dies, you mourn the loss of your fiance. Especially because with your fiance, that means that you were planning a life together, that you probably had a life together. And that also means that you have to say goodbye, not just to the person, but also to the whole set of fantasies and expectations around that person and that relationship. And that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of healing and a lot of emotional work. If I had to recommend something very practical for you, I would recommend most of the books by Pema Chodron, for example. She has a book called When Things Fall Apart. She has another one now. I can't remember the title. It's also quite good. I'm halfway through it, but after talking about hair pulling and George Kelly for 2 hours, I cannot remember it. But yeah, I would recommend her books because most of her books actually deal with how to open up to suffering and how to allow that suffering to change our lives for the better. And in terms of pulling, I mean, TrichStop is an option. Therapy is an option. If you don't think you can afford therapy, there are books that you can use. Just 1 second, I'm being rude, but I have one book that I just recently purchased and started reading that's actually a self-help manual for pulling. It's not the perfect book the most perfect book in the world, but considering how little there is on the subject, it's quite good. It's not acceptance and commitment therapy based, but it is still useful. It's called Overcoming Body Focused Repetitive Behaviors, a comprehensive behavioral treatment for hair pulling and skin picking, by Mansueto, Varvicek, and Golon. I mean, here you go. This is the cover, so you can find it on Amazon. I hope you can see it. So that's something that I could recommend for self-help. I would always prefer to recommend therapy over self-help because in my experience with clients who have attempted self-help programs, they usually give up because there's no one to hold you accountable. Sometimes I compile the hairs I pull and end up looking at them and feeling terribly about what I've done. Why do people collect the hairs they pull? I don't understand why I do this. I will just give you some random examples that I can think of because there are really many reasons for this. Some people use this as a kind of trophy, like that's proof that you've done good work pulling. Some people collect the hair and then look at the hair because they get pleasure from sort of touching the hair and then observing all its details. So that's not something they do after the pulling ritual. That is a part of the pulling ritual. Sometimes it's the part of the pulling ritual. Sometimes people will swallow the hairs or break them up. And then there are sometimes when people keep the hairs together and then look at them so that they can use it as a kind of reminder of what they've done. This can be a positive thing in the sense that you can use that as motivation not to do it again. But I'm afraid that more often than not, they use that as a proof that they're failures as human beings. So they will collect this hair and this will somehow be an act of invalidation. That's, you know how I talk about sort of adding suffering on top of suffering? Well, that would be it. Using these to remind yourself of what you've done. Unless you use that as motivation to change, you're actually just increasing your suffering. So that's what happens also very frequently. So Pema Chodron's books, Living Beautifully, Taking the Leap. Yeah, Living Beautifully is a very good book. The one that I also like is her commentary on Shantideva's work, but that's sort of very technical and Buddhisty, so that's not for everyone. But I think she has a very sensible and very interesting approach to that as well. It's also a very practical book. But Things Fall Apart is the first one that I read and the one that's still my favorite. So I think this would be a good time to stop. I would like to thank you for sticking with me for over 2 hours and for asking questions. And those questions that I didn't get to, you can email them to me. You have my email address here. If you have any questions about the program or I don't know how to pay for it or how it works, you can, for the therapeutical part, you can ask me. And for both the therapy questions and the technical questions, you can ask our support team. I would like to really thank you for sticking around for so long, and I hope to see you next month. The topic will be mindfulness and how to use mindfulness to deal with bullying. So I wish you a pleasant evening at this point, and hope to see you next month.